The wind howled across the open plains, dragging dust and whispers through the scattered wagons of the small frontier caravan. The embers of last night's fire glowed faintly, soon to be forgotten, like the woman who still slept near them. Eleanor Carter stirred, cold creeping into her bones. She reached for the threadbare wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders, but even its meager warmth could not keep out the truth of her situation. She had lost everything: her husband, her home, her place in the world. And now, she was barely more than a ghost, trailing behind the settlers who once called her one of their own. She sat up, brushing away strands of hair stiff with dust. The morning air carried the scent of horses and sweat, of coffee brewing over distant fires. The others were already preparing to move westward again. She watched as families murmured to one another, parents adjusting their children's blankets, men tightening straps on their packs. She had once been part of such careful preparations, but now no one spoke to her. No one even looked her way. A voice, low and firm, broke through the clatter of movement. She slows us down. Eleanor stiffened. Jacob Rollins. His voice carried the weight of a man who made decisions, not requests. She lost her husband. Another voice offered, not quite defending her, but not entirely without sympathy. It ain't right to... She lost her husband 3 weeks ago, and she's been dragging behind ever since. Rollins cut in sharply. You think the wilderness cares if it's right? The winter will hit us before we reach Fort Bridger, if we keep this pace. He exhaled through his nose. She's dead weight, and if she can't keep up, she stays behind. Eleanor's fingers dug into the fabric of her skirt. She had suspected it, of course. The silence, the way food had become scarcer when it reached her hands, the whispers at night when they thought she was sleeping. She was a burden, and out here, burdens were left behind. She rose slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. As she stepped into the thinning darkness, she saw them, Rollins, flanked by 2 men, their faces hardened like the land around them. He met her gaze without flinching. You knew this was coming, he said. Not cruel, not kind, just fact. She swallowed hard. You mean to leave me? No one spoke. The morning sun began to crest over the horizon, painting the sky in gold and fire. She looked past Rollins, toward the wagons, where women tended to their children, where men hitched horses. The world moved on. Without her, her voice was quiet but firm. You'll be leaving me to die. Rollins sighed. We're leaving you to your own devices. He gestured to the land stretching endlessly around them. If you find your way, you find your way. And if I don't... He did not answer. Something inside her fractured. This was not grief that had come before, had hollowed her out when she buried Nathan in shallow dirt with her bare hands. This was something colder, heavier, the weight of understanding. She wanted to beg. She wanted to scream. But she knew it would do nothing. Instead, she forced herself to stand taller. At least leave me a horse, she said. Rollins shook his head. We can't spare one. A bitter laugh broke from her lips. You mean you won't? His jaw tightened. It's done, Eleanor. She wanted to hate them. She wanted to curse them all, to tear their names from her heart and let the wind carry them away. But she was too tired. No one met her eyes as the wagons rolled forward. Dust rose in thick clouds, choking the air, obscuring their figures as they disappeared into the west. She watched them go, her breath shallow, her fists clenched. Then she was alone. The silence was absolute. No voices, no clatter of hooves, just a wind, stirring the grass, whispering secrets of the land she did not know. She turned slowly, surveying the nothingness that stretched before her. The plains rolled in golden waves, broken only by the jagged outline of distant cliffs. The sky was too big. The land was too empty. Panic clawed at her chest. She had no food, no water, no weapon. She was going to die. A sob built in her throat, but she swallowed it down. Crying would do nothing. She forced herself to breathe, to think. The settlers had traveled west. South led to more open plains, nothing but grass and sky. But to the north, mountains, distant but there. If there was shelter anywhere, it would be there. Her feet felt like lead as she walked. One step, then another, the weight of the world pressing against her shoulders. Hours passed. The sun climbed high, scorching the land. Her throat burned. Her legs ached. She tripped over a loose stone, crashing to the ground. Dust filled her mouth, her nose. She lay there for a long time, listening to the blood pounding in her ears. Maybe this was it. Maybe she should stop. No. Gritting her teeth, she forced herself to rise. Step, step, step. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in red and violet. The mountains remained distant, unmoved by her suffering. Her vision blurred. Her limbs trembled. Then, movement. She blinked. A shadow against the horizon. No, not one. Several. Moving fast. Riders. Her heart lurched. Settlers wouldn't come back for her. That meant one thing. Indians. She barely had the strength to stand, let alone run. The riders grew closer, dust curling behind them. Eleanor tried to stay upright, but her body had had enough. The world tilted, darkness creeping at the edges of her vision. The last thing she saw was the face of man, framed by the setting sun, his dark eyes unreadable. Then nothing. Eleanor drifted between darkness and awareness, her body weightless, her mind untethered. Somewhere beyond the haze, she heard the rhythmic thud of hooves against the earth, the creak of leather, the distant cry of an eagle cutting through the vast sky. Every breath she took was filled with dust and the scent of something unfamiliar, sage, smoke, and the faint musk of horses. Her body ached. Every joint, every muscle screamed in protest as if she'd been dragged across the land itself. She forced her eyes open, but the light was too harsh, burning into her skull. A groan escaped her lips, weak and rasping. The movement beneath her stopped. She felt hands, strong, callous, careful, adjusting her weight. The ground seemed to rise up to meet her as she was lowered onto something soft but unyielding. Her fingers curled into rough fibers. A blanket? She blinked against the brightness, vision swimming, and finally saw him. A man crouched a few feet away, watching her with dark, unwavering eyes. He was unlike any man she had ever seen. His skin was bronzed by the sun, his black hair tied back from his face. A bough rested across his lap, his fingers tracing the string with absent precision. His presence was as still as the land around them, his expression unreadable. Eleanor's breath hitched. Her mind clawed for understanding, for context, but all she could focus on was the fact that she was alive, and he was a reason. She tried to push herself up, but her body betrayed her, muscles trembling with the effort. The man's eyes flicked to her struggle, and after a moment's hesitation, he reached for a small, round vessel beside him. Without a word, he lifted it to her lips. Water, cool and clean, it flooded her parched throat. She drank greedily, nearly choking in her desperation. When she had taken her fill, he pulled the vessel away, watching her with the patience of a hunter studying wounded prey. She licked her cracked lips, her voice hoarse. "Who are you?" He didn't answer. Eleanor swallowed, forcing her breath to steady. "Where am I?" Silence stretched between them. She scanned her surroundings, taking in the rolling plains and the sparse clusters of trees that reached toward a sky streaked with the deep reds and purples of twilight. A small fire burned nearby, its flickering glow illuminating the edges of a worn saddle and the faint outline of horses grazing just beyond the ridge. She was alone with him. A cold shiver ran down her spine, but she tamped down her fear. He had saved her. If he had wanted her dead, he wouldn't have bothered. She tried again. "Did you find me?" The man studied her for a long moment before speaking. His voice was low, steady, the words carefully chosen. "You were dying." His English was rough, but clear. She exhaled shakily. "Yes." Another silence, heavy with things unspoken. She shifted, attempted to sit up fully, but pain lanced through her side, sharp and unforgiving. She winced. He did not move to help her, but his gaze remained locked onto her, assessing, measuring. Eleanor took in his clothing, the worn buckskin, the beads adorning his belt, the knife resting at his side. She had heard stories from the settlers about men like him, stories filled with fear, with warnings of raids and stolen lives. But he had saved her. She swallowed, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Thank you." The man didn't react. She hesitated. "Do you have a name?" A pause. Then, "So am I." The name was unfamiliar on her tongue, but she repeated it softly, letting it settle between them. He did not correct her. The wind stirred, carrying the distant howl of a coyote. The fire crackled, filling the silence that stretched between them once more. Eleanor felt exhaustion creeping in again, her body too weak to fight it. Her eyes drifted shut. She did not dream. When she woke, the night had deepened, the sky a sea of endless stars. The fire had burned lower, casting shadows that danced across the rocks. Soanoai sat nearby, sharpening a blade with slow, deliberate movements. Eleanor shifted, pushing herself up with careful determination. This time, she did not collapse. Her limbs were weak, but they obeyed. He watched her, but said nothing. A question burned in her mind, one she'd been too afraid to ask before. "What are you going to do with me?" The scraping of stone against metal ceased. Soanoai lifted his gaze to hers, unreadable in the dim firelight. "You are not strong enough to leave." It wasn't an answer. Not really. She wet her lips. "And when I am?" He considered her for a moment, then returned to his blade. "Then you leave." Something about the certainty in his voice made her chest tighten. She should have felt relief, but instead, there was something else, something she could not name. The settlers had left her to die without hesitation. This man, a stranger, had saved her without reason. "Why?" she whispered. Soanoai did not look up. "I do not let the desert take what it has not yet earned." His words were simple, but they held weight. Eleanor wrapped the blanket tighter around herself, staring into the fire. The world she had known had abandoned her. Perhaps it was time to learn another. Eleanor awoke to the scent of smoke and the distant rustling of leaves. The air was crisp, tinged with the earthy aroma of damp soil. Dawn painted the sky in soft hues of lavender and gold, stretching endlessly over the horizon. She stirred beneath the blanket, her body aching but no longer fragile. She was healing. Across the fire, Soanoai sat in silence, carving a piece of wood with slow, methodical precision. He had barely spoken since the night he had saved her, yet his presence had become something steady, something she had begun to rely on. Her stomach tightened with hunger. The last meal she had eaten was a handful of dried berries he had given her the evening before. She hesitated before speaking. "I need to find food." Soanoai did not glance up from his carving. "You cannot yet hunt." Frustration flared in her chest. She was tired of feeling helpless, tired of being at the mercy of others. "Then teach me." This time, he did look up. His gaze was steady, unreadable. A long moment passed before he nodded once. "Come." Eleanor pushed herself up, ignoring the stiffness in her limbs. She followed him beyond the small camp, her heartbeat quickening with the realization that this was the first time she had ventured away from it. The vast wilderness stretched before her, untamed and endless. Soanoai led her to a nearby creek, where the water flowed clear and cold over smooth stones. He crouched beside it, dipping his fingers in the current before motioning for her to do the same. "Water first," he said simply. Eleanor knelt, cupping the liquid in her hands and bringing it to her lips. It was cool and clean, sending a shiver down her spine. When she had drunk her fill, Soanoai rose and motioned for her to follow once more. They moved through the underbrush in silence, his footsteps soundless, hers clumsy in comparison. He stopped suddenly, raising a hand for her to do the same. Then, with slow precision, he knelt and pointed to a cluster of tracks in the dirt. "Rabbit," he murmured. Eleanor studied the tracks, their delicate imprints barely visible in the earth. She had never noticed such things before, never needed to. Now, she realized how blind she had been. Soanoai reached into the pouch at his waist and pulled out a snare made of thinly braided sinew. He demonstrated how to set it, his fingers deft and sure, then handed her another. "You try." She mimicked his movements, her fingers fumbling as she tried to twist the loop just right. Frustration prickled at her, but she forced herself to remain calm. Soanoai watched, saying nothing, allowed her to learn through her own mistakes. Finally, the snare was set. She sat back, exhaling. He gave a small nod, the closest thing to approval she had received from him. As they walked back toward camp, Eleanor found herself studying him as much as she studied the land. He moved with a quiet confidence, his presence blending into the wilderness as if he belonged to it in a way she never could. Yet, despite his silence, she sensed something beneath it, a patience, a willingness to teach. That evening, they checked the snares. One had caught a rabbit. Eleanor stared at the small, lifeless body, a lump forming in her throat. She had never killed anything before. She had seen her husband do it, seen men in the settlement butcher livestock, but this felt different. This was hers. Soanoi knelt beside her. "You must finish what you start." His words were not unkind, but they held weight. Her hands trembled as she picked up the rabbit. It was still warm. She hesitated, but then, with a deep breath, she did what needed to be done. That night, they ate together, the fire crackling between them. The meat was simple, cooked over open flames, but it was the best thing she had ever tasted. She had earned it. She caught Soanoi watching her, something unreadable in his gaze. "You are learning," he said at last. Eleanor met his eyes, feeling something shift inside her. "So are you," she replied. For the first time, he almost smiled. The wind carried the scent of smoke before Eleanor saw the flames. A sick feeling twisted in her gut as she crested the ridge, her breath catching at the sight below. Soanoi's camp, the place she had come to know as safety, was under attack. 3 men moved through the clearing, their rifles slung over their shoulders, their boots kicking up dust as they rummaged through his belongings. Their faces were unfamiliar, but Eleanor knew men like them. Settlers who saw anything beyond their own world as savage. Theirs to take or destroy. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She dropped to her knees behind a boulder, her mind racing. Soanoi had gone to check the traps along the creek. He wasn't here, but he would be soon. And if he walked into this, they would kill him. She reached the knife at her waist, her fingers tightening around the hilt. A month ago, she wouldn't have known what to do. A month ago, she would have hidden, prayed for rescue. But now, she knew the land. She knew how to move silently, how to disappear into the shadows. She had learned. Eleanor exhaled, steadying her grip, and moved. The first man was closest to fire, crouched beside Soanoi's belongings. His rifle leaned against a nearby rock, within reach but not in his hands. She stepped carefully, each footfall deliberate, her body moving low and controlled the way Soanoi had shown her when stalking prey. A twig snapped beneath her boot. The man turned, eyes narrowing, but before he could speak, Eleanor lunged. The knife sank into his side. He choked on a breath, his hands clawing at her, but she twisted the blade and wrenched it free. He collapsed with a strangled sound, his body crumpling into the dirt. The second man shouted, reaching for his rifle. Eleanor snatched up the fallen one, leveling at him with shaking hands. "Don't!" Her voice was sharp, unwavering. He hesitated, his fingers twitching over his weapon. A whistle sliced through the air. The man barely had time to turn before an arrow embedded itself in his throat. Eleanor gasped as he staggered, blood spilling from his lips. He dropped his gun and crumpled to the ground. She spun. Soanoi stood at the edge of the trees, another arrow already notched in his bow. His eyes flicked to her, taking in the scene, the body at her feet, the knife in her hand, the blood on her fingers. The third man bolted. Soanoi loosed another arrow. It struck the man's shoulder, sending him sprawling. Before he could rise, Soanoi was on him, dragging him up by the collar and slamming him against a tree. The man gasped, struggling, but the grip around his throat tightened. Eleanor stepped closer, her breath still ragged. "Who sent you?" The man coughed, his hands clawing at Soanoi's wrist. His eyes darted between them, wild with fear. We were just tracking," he stammered. "Didn't know anyone was here." "Lies!" Soanoi's voice was quiet, but it cut like a blade. The man trembled. "Please, we won't come back. Just let me—" Soanoi's grip didn't waver. His eyes darkened, his jaw set. Eleanor had seen him kill before. Quick, efficient, merciless. He had every reason to do so now. But something inside her hesitated. She stepped forward, her fingers brushing against Sonoai's arm. Let him go. His gaze snapped to her. He's done, she said, her voice softer now. He'll run, and he'll tell others not to come. Sonoai held her gaze for a long moment. Then, slowly, his fingers uncurled. The man collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. He scrambled to his feet and stumbled into the trees, vanishing into the night. Silence settled over them. Eleanor exhaled, turning back to the fire. Her hands were still stained with blood, but she felt no fear, no regret, only certainty. Sonoai watched her. He had seen the woman she had been, the one left for dead, the one who had clung to fear. Now, he saw someone else entirely. She met his gaze. I'm not leaving. His brow furrowed, his lips parting slightly, as if it expected her to say something else. I had nowhere before this, she continued. Now I do. A long silence stretched between them, but she didn't look away. Finally, Sonoai nodded, not just in agreement, but in understanding. The fire crackled between them, the night vast and endless, and Eleanor knew she had survived not just the wilderness, but herself,